So today I'm going to be walking through how to make this tie strap shirred back jumpsuit. I also have this pattern available as a top and a dress, and all of those patterns are available on my store, which is linked down below. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, and I think that's everything, so let's get on with the tutorial. So this is everything that you're going to need for this particular tutorial. So you will need a woven fabric. This is cotton poplin that I'm using, which works really well. I'm also going to be using some picot elastic around my straps and my pockets, but that is optional, so you can skip that if you want, or you can use lace or whatever you can get your hands on. You're going to need some thread, some pins, a tape measure and a ruler, some shirring elastic for the back of the top. You will need some fabric pens or some tailor's chalk, fabric scissors or a rotary cutter, and an iron. So I'm going to be using two sewing machines for this project. My regular machine, which is one of the Singer heavy duty machines, and my overlocker. You may also know of this as a serger, and I'm using the Brother Lock 734DS. This is optional. If you don't have one of these, don't worry, you can just use the zigzag stitch on your regular machine instead. So for this project, I will be using the jumpsuit version of my Flora pattern, and you will have 5 pattern pieces for this pattern. So the first pattern piece is pattern piece 1, which is the front of the top. You will need to cut 2 of these out, and you will need to cut them on the fold. Pattern piece 2 is the back of the top. Again, you will need to cut 2 of these out, and again you will need to cut them on the fold. And I have pattern piece 3, which is the front of the trousers. You will need to cut 2 of these out. And pattern piece 4 is the back of the trousers. Again, you will need to cut 2 of these out. And finally, pattern piece 5 is the pocket, and you will need to cut 4 of these out. So now you can move on to start cutting out your pieces, but first you want to make sure your fabric is laid out correctly. So you want to find the selvage edge of your fabric, which is the finished edge. So you should be able to see that you have an edge that is finished so that it doesn't fray like your other edges. Just zoom in slightly. So hopefully you can see that this edge is the finished edge, which is your selvage edge, and then this edge along here is still a raw edge, so it frays quite easily. So you want to find the 2 selvage edges of your fabric. So I've got 2 here, and fold the fabric with those 2 selvage edges, one on top of the other. I've got my selvage edge here, 2 selvage edges on top of each other, and then my fold over at the other side. So once your fabric is laid out correctly, you can start to lay out your pattern pieces. So you'll have 2 pieces, the front of the top and the back of the top, that need to be lined up to the fold. And obviously that is quite straightforward. You will just line them up to the fold on that side, but you will also have 3 pieces that don't line up to the fold. So that will be the pocket and both of your trousers. So for these pieces, you want to find this line that comes up the center of that pocket, and this is the grain line. And you just want to make sure that that grain line is parallel to your selvage edge. So you can lay them out however you want, just making sure that all of your pieces that need to line up to the fold do line up to the fold, and all of your pieces that don't line up to the fold line up to that selvage edge. So I'm going to draw out some of my pieces now. So now that I've finished drawing those pieces out, I'm just going to take some pins and start to pin within those shapes that I've drawn. That's just going to make sure that when we start to cut things out, that the shapes stay accurate on both sides of the fabric. And once those pins are in place, you can start to cut your pieces out, just being careful to make sure that you're always cutting through 2 layers of fabric. And I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting the rest of my pieces out off camera. So at this stage, you should have all of your pieces cut out. So for your top, you should have 2 pieces for the back of the top, 8 pieces for the straps, and 2 pieces for the front of the top. And then for your trousers, you will have 2 pieces for the front of the trousers, 2 pieces for the back of the trousers, and 4 pieces for your pockets. So I'm going to start by making my straps. So for my straps, I've got 2 of my 8 pieces here, and I've also just cut a couple of pieces of that elastic that I'm going to add to be the same size as those long edges. Again, you don't need to do this, you can skip this part, but if you do want to add these, I'm just going to lay them onto those straps, lining up the straight edge of the elastic to the straight edge of the strap. I'm just going to lay them like this. If your fabric has an obvious right or wrong side, you want to be adding these to the right side of the fabric. So just like that. And again, skip that if you don't want to add any elastic or lace or anything. And then take your second strap and lay it right sides facing together with the other strap on top of all of those pieces. And now I'm just going to take some pins and I'm going to pin along both of the long edges and along one of the two short edges. And then once those pins are in place, you can go and sew each of those edges. So along both of the long edges and the one short edge that you've got, making sure to leave one of the short edges open because we're going to use that to turn the strap to the right side out. I'm going to use my overlocker just because it tends to be a little bit easier when you've sandwiched some elastic or lace in there, but you can just use a standard straight stitch as well. So once you've got those seams sewn in place, you can start to turn the strap to the right side out. One thing that I did forget to mention is that if you are using some lace or elastic or anything to trim your straps with, I would recommend sewing both of the long edges in place and then the short edge at the end. That just makes sure that whatever you've trimmed your strap with gets kind of tucked under and you don't have any raw edges. So I'll show you what I mean when I've turned this to the right side. So this is how my strap is looking. Hopefully you can see what I mean about how that trim gets kind of folded over rather than having a raw edge like it does down here. Now the only thing left to do with this strap is to add a top stitch to make sure that the strap sits nice and flat. So I'm literally just going to sew up both of those long edges with a straight stitch. I'm not going to do either of the ends because you don't need to. Just up both of those long edges. So this is how that top stitch should look. And then once you've done that, you just want to repeat the same steps for your remaining straps so that you have 4 identical straps. Now you can put these to one side and start working on the top. So I'm going to start by working on the front of the top, and the first thing we need to do is to add the darts. Now darts are just a fold in your garment to create a bit more shape. You can see on the pattern the dart here is this triangle, so we want to add that to both sides of this pattern because obviously it was cut out on the fold, and the easiest way to transfer the lines of that dart onto your fabric is to just cut this out from the pattern. And now I can grab my fabric pen and just draw those new lines onto the wrong side of my fabric. And it should look something like that, and then I'm just going to flip the pattern and draw my second dart in place. So once those darts are drawn in place, the next step is to create the folds and start to pin them in place. I'm just going to zoom in slightly. So I'm going to fold the piece with right sides facing together so that these two lines lay one on top of the other. So we're just folding down the center of that dart and then start to pin that in place. The first place that I like to add a pin is just at the end here. And then the rest of the pins are going to come along this line here. These are called the legs of the dart. So I'm going to place the pin through the line on one side, and then I'm going to check if it goes through the line on the other side, which for that one it does, so that's perfect. And then just continue with the rest of that line. Again, placing the pin through the line on one side and checking if it goes through the line on the other side, which it does. And then placing that final pin. And again, that goes through on one side and goes through on the other side as well. I'm just going to show you slightly closer up as well. So I've got all the pins going through the line of that dart on one side, but also along the other side. So I'm just going to repeat that for my second dart. And once those two darts are pinned in place, you want to sew along those lines with a straight stitch. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that on my machine. So I've just got my machine set up to a standard straight stitch. I'm going to start to sew along one of those lines, just taking that first pin out. I'm going to make sure I'm nicely lined up and put the needle down, and then I'm just going to start by reversing just to secure that stitch at that end, and then I'm just going to follow along the rest of this line. Take that next pin out. And as we come to this point here, I'm not going to reverse, I'm just going to sew straight off the end, and then I'm going to tie that off. So make sure you leave enough of a tail that you can tie it in a couple of knots. Just sew straight off. I'm just going to trim that. So I've got my dart here, and then I've got these threads at the point of the dart. I'm just going to tie this in a couple of knots. And then trim that off. And then I'm just going to go in and repeat that for my second dart. And that's how those darts should be looking once they're sewn in place. The final thing I'm going to do with these darts is to just press them flat. I like to press mine towards my armholes. And then the same on this side. And then you just want to repeat that for your remaining piece of the front of the top. And now I'm going to move on to prepare the back of the top. So for the back of the top, the first thing I'm going to do is to just mark on this guide here that's going to show us where to attach the straps to. So I need to mark that onto both sides because obviously this was cut on the fold. Just mark it there and then flip the pattern and mark it on this side as well. And then once you have that guide in place, the next step is to draw the guide that we're going to follow for our shirring. So firstly, I'm going to mark out the spacing of those lines. So I'm going to start about 1.5 centimeters from the top. And then just from that mark there, I'm just going to mark in centimeter intervals. And then once you get to the last section down here, you just want to leave a bit of a gap for seam allowance. So I'm leaving about 2 centimeters, 1.5 would be good as well, just anything more than 1 centimeter down at the bottom. And then I'm just going to repeat this on the other side seam. And then once you've drawn out that spacing on both sides, I'm just going to join them up with a straight line. And I forgot to mention this should all be going onto the right side of your fabric. So the marks for the straps and the shirring lines all want to go onto the right side of the fabric. So make sure you're either using a tailor's chalk or a water-soluble fabric pen, something that you're going to be able to get rid of eventually. Just continuing to work through each of those marks until you've filled the whole piece. And then once you've got that guide drawn in place, you can move over to your machine to start adding the shirring. If you're new to shirring, you might want to practice on some scraps first. So firstly, we need to set up our machine so that we can use shirring elastic in it. So I've got the top of my machine threaded up as normal, just with normal thread through the needle. I've got my machine set to a straight stitch and I'm going to up the length to the highest length possible, which is a 4 on my machine. And then we also need to wind some bobbins. So you can see here, I've just wound some of this elastic onto a bobbin. I'll just grab an empty one. And you want to do this by hand, you don't want to do this on your machine. Literally just want to wind that round the bobbin. Try not to stretch it. And then once you have that elastic wound onto the bobbin, you want to load it into your machine as you would with any other bobbin. I'm just going to pick that up with my thread and pull it out of the way. And then once you've got your machine set up, you can just start to sew along these straight lines that you've got. I just like to reverse at the start to make sure that stitch is as secure as possible. and also reversing at the end and trimming that off. And you'll be able to see that the piece is starting to kind of bunch together, which is what the shirring is going to do. I'm just going to continue sewing down each of those lines that I've drawn. And that's the second line sewn in place. It's going to start to gather more and more the more of these lines that you sew in place. So your piece will be much smaller when you get to the end of all these lines. I'm going to do the rest of mine off camera. The shirred panel should roughly half in length. If it doesn't, you may need to change some of the settings on your machine. So your back panel should be looking something like this when you've done sewing those lines. It should be nice and stretchy, and you want to repeat that for your remaining panel for the back of the top so that you have 2 shirred panels. And now you can put these to one side for the time being. So now that you've got all of your individual pieces made, you can start to put everything together. So starting with the front of the top, I'm going to take one of my pieces and then lay my second piece one on top of the other with right sides facing together. Just match up those corresponding edges, and then I'm going to pin around the armhole on both sides. And I'm just going to sew around both of those armholes with a straight stitch. And once those armholes are sewn in place, I want to grab 2 of my straps, and I'm going to place these straps in between the 2 layers of my top and just line up that raw edge of the strap to the neckline of the top. And you can pin these straps wherever you like, but I like to keep mine nice and close to that armhole. So I'm going to pin mine in place there. I like to have my strap poking out slightly because it makes sure that you don't miss any of the strap when you're sewing it in place. And pin it at the top here. I like to pin it at the bottom here to make sure that it stays facing straight down, and I'm going to do the same with my second strap. And then once those straps are pinned in place, I'm just going to pin the rest of the way along that neckline. And now you can sew straight across the top of that neckline, just being very careful to make sure that you get both layers of the top and also the straps included in that seam. So just straight across here. And then once you've sewn across that top edge, you can put this piece to one side for now, and now I'm going to finish off the back of the top. So I'm going to take one of my back pieces and my 2 remaining straps. I'm going to find that guide that I left to tell me where to attach those straps, and I'm going to attach the center of the strap to that guide. If you want to find the exact center of the strap, you can fold them in half and pin that in place. I'm just going to do that with my second strap as well. And then I'm going to take the second piece of the back of the top and lay that on top of all those pieces with right sides facing together. I'm just going to pin it in place at a few points. So firstly, at this side seam, just at the very top here. So pin it in place there. I'm going to pin all the way through the strap and the piece that we've got at the back here, and then I can remove this first pin. I'm going to do the same on the other side, and then I'm just going to put a pin roughly at the center as well. I might have to move that. So now I'm going to sew right across this top edge, and as you're doing this, because of the shirring, you will have to stretch the piece, which is why I've not put many pins in place. Like I said, you might have to move some of the pins while you're sewing, but they might help initially. I'll show you exactly how I'm going to do it on my machine. So I've got my machine set up to a straight stitch. I've just changed the length back down to 2.5, which is the standard length that I use. And I'm just going to start to sew along that top edge. Taking out that first pin, I'm going to reverse at the start. So as you stretch, you want to make sure the needle is down in the fabric. So I'm just going to stretch between each pin that I've added. And just be very careful as you're coming over these straps to make sure that you're getting everything in your seam. The trickiest thing about this, I find normally, is to keep the two layers of fabric together while you are stretching. So just make sure that you really take your time and do a small section at a time. Just coming up to that second strap. Again, make sure you're very careful to get all layers. And reversing at the end. And then before you move on, I would really recommend going in and checking you haven't missed anything in that seam, because it can be quite easy to do. I think mine looks okay for now. And then once you've sewn across that top edge, you can just turn this piece to the right side out. So that should look something like this. And now I can combine this with the front of the top. So the front of the top should be inside out. I'm going to keep the back of the top the right way out. And I'm just going to place the back of the top inside the front of the top. You will notice that the back of the top is now a lot smaller than the front of the top, now that we've added that shirring. And I'm just going to start to pin the side seams of the back of the top inside the side seam of the front of the top. This will be one of the fiddliest parts of the construction, just because that shirred panel tends to curl under slightly, and you'll want it to sit nice and flat when you pin it. So I'd recommend using quite a few pins here. And then once those pins are in place, I'm going to pull the shirred panel over to the other side seam and pin along that side seam as well. So that's how my top will look once both of those side seams are pinned in place. Don't worry that the front of your top will bunch up. That's just because obviously the back of the top is now smaller than the front. So now I'm going to go in with a straight stitch and just sew straight down those side seams. Just make sure that you're getting all 4 layers in this seam, because it can be quite easy for one of them to pull out the way. And once those side seams are sewn in place, I'm just going to turn this top to the right side out. And it should look something like this. And now I'm going to move on to make the trousers. So I've got one of the pieces of the front of my trousers here, and I'm going to start by adding a pocket guide down this side that's just going to help us to more accurately match up those pockets. So I'm going to take my pattern, and you should be able to see the pocket guide just along this side. So I'm just going to mark that onto the right side of my fabric. And these marks are called notches, and they're just used to help you to match up your pattern pieces. So I'm going to mark the 2 lines, which are going to be the top and bottom of the pocket. And then you've got this triangle in the center, which is how most notches normally look. But I'm not going to draw it as a triangle. I'm just going to draw a line below it like that. So that's how that pocket guide looks. And you just want to repeat that for all of the pieces of your trousers. So both pieces of the front of the trousers and both pieces of the back of the trousers. And once you've got those notches marked onto your trousers, you also need to mark this 1 notch onto your pocket as well, and that's going to be the notch that matches up to the trousers. So just mark that in place, and then obviously you have the lines at the top and bottom that are going to tell you exactly where that pocket should start and end. And now the next thing that you need to mark onto these patterns is the dart for the front of the trousers. So this is your dart here, and I'm going to draw that onto my trousers in exactly the same way as I did with the top. So I'm just going to cut that out and draw those lines in place. You want to make sure that this dart is going onto the wrong side of your fabric, so the opposite side to the side that you added those pocket guides. And now I'm just going to create the shape for that dart, again in exactly the same way as I did with the top. And don't worry that you can see my pocket guide here, it's just bleeding through from the other side. So I'm going to fold my dart with right sides facing together along the center of that dart. And I'm just going to pin along the lines of that dart. And then just like we did with the top, we want to make sure that the pins go through the line on this side, but that they also go through the line on the other side as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and sew that in place, again in the same way that I did with my top. So I'm just going to take a straight stitch, reverse at the top here, follow along that line, and then just sew straight off the end and tie that off in a couple of knots. So now that I have sewn that dart in place, the final thing I'm going to do is to just press it flat. And then you want to repeat all of those steps for the remaining piece of the front of your trousers. So at this stage, you should have 2 pieces for the front of your trousers, both with those darts added. And you need to make sure that if you are using a fabric like me that doesn't have an obvious right or wrong side, that you add those darts in a way that makes sure that when you have your pieces laid out like I have here with the right side facing up, that you have 2 pieces that face in towards each other like I have here, rather than adding those darts in a way where both of your pieces face in the same direction. That's quite important if you are using a fabric like I am. Now we can move on to attaching these 2 together. So now taking the 2 pieces of the front of my trousers, I'm going to lay them one on top of the other with right sides facing together. I'm just going to line them up and I'm going to pin around the crotch here. And once those pins are added, you can just sew that crotch in place with a straight stitch. I'm also going to finish off the raw edge with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. So that's how that seam is looking, and now I'm going to go on to add my pockets. So I'm just going to find that guide that I added earlier and match the pocket up to that with right sides facing together. And then I'm going to pin it in place along this straight edge. And then once you've added those pins, you can go in and repeat for your second pocket on the other side. And then I'm going to go in with a straight stitch and just sew down this straight edge. And I'm going to finish off that edge with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. So once that pocket is sewn in place, the final thing I'm just going to do is to fold it out and press it flat. Now you can move on to the back of your trousers, which is going to be pretty much exactly the same steps as you did for the front of the trousers. The only difference is that you won't have a dart. So for the back of your trousers, you just want to sew the crotch in place in the same way that you did for the front and add those pockets. So the back of your trousers should be looking at something like this. I'm going to take the front of my trousers and with right sides facing together, lay them on top of the back of the trousers. I'm just going to start to match up those corresponding edges. And I'm going to start to pin these 2 pieces together along the side seams on both sides, coming around those pockets and down, and then up the inside leg on both sides. So once you've added those pins, you can go ahead and sew those edges in place with a straight stitch. I'm also going to finish off my raw edges with an overlocker, but you can also use a zigzag stitch. So that's how those seams are looking once they're sewn in place. And now I can move on to add the top to my trousers. The first thing I'm going to do is to just find some points that I'm going to place some pins in, and those points are going to help us to more accurately match up the top to the jumpsuit, especially when it comes to the back of the top, because when we are sewing the waistline of the top to the waistline of the trousers, you will have to stretch the back of the top. So I'll give you a couple of ways that you can make that a bit easier. So firstly, I'm going to find the center front and center back of the top. So I want to fold my top with the side seams one on top of the other, and the center front is this fold here. And then for the center back, I just like to stretch this slightly to check that this is the exact center back, and it is. So I'm going to place a pin there, and you can stop here if you want. If you just want to add 2 pins, and that will mean that when you are sewing around the back, you will have to stretch this much fabric. But if you want to make that slightly less, make it slightly easier and slightly more precise, you can find a couple more points. So the next one is to fold the piece so that the center back is on top of the side seam, and then again stretch that to make sure you've got the center of that point, and place a pin, and then doing the same on this side. So fold in so that the center back pin is on top of the side seam, and stretch. And place a pin at that point. And now that's how my center back is looking. It's essentially split into 4 quarters now. That will make it a lot easier when you want to sew that in place. And then for the front of my top, I've just got that one central pin in place because you shouldn't need more than that at this stage. And now I'm going to go in and do the same thing with my trousers. So when you come to finding those same points on your trousers, it's a little bit more straightforward because we already know where the center front and the center back is, because that's where we sewed the crotch seam in place. So you don't necessarily need to add pins to these points, but I'm going to anyway, just so it's easier to visualize how we're going to attach that top. So center front and center back. I'm just going to flip this over to the back side. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the top to find these quarter points. So I'm going to fold the piece so that this center back point is on top of the side seam. And this fold here is one of our quarter points. And then I'm going to do the same for the other side. So just taking the center back and folding so that it's on top of the side seam on the other side. And then again, placing a pin at that fold. So now the back of my trousers are looking like this with the 3 pins in place, and you've got 4 quarter sections here. Again, if you don't want to, you don't need to add all of these pins. You can just go with the center front and center back, but this will make it a little bit easier. And then for the front, we've just got the single center pin. So now I'm going to grab my top and place it inside these trousers. So at this point, you want to make sure your top is the right way out and that your trousers are inside out. And I'm going to place this top inside the trousers, making sure that the front of the top, which is the side with the darts, is facing the front of the trousers, which again is the side with the darts. And then once your top is inside those trousers, I'm just going to start to pin together those points that we found. So the center front of the top to the center front of the trousers. You can take out the spare pin. I'm going to pin the side seam of the trousers to the side seam of the top. And the same on the other side. And then I'm just going to flip this over to the back, and I'm going to pin the center back of the trousers to the center back of the top. And again, take out that spare pin, and then I'm going to do the same thing with these quarter points. And once you've got those points pinned in place at the back, I like to go in and check that everything fits nicely, because it's quite easy with the shirring and the back panel to pin things slightly wrong. So I just like to go in and stretch each quarter to check that that back panel is fitting correctly within the trousers, and it looks like it is there. So now I'm going to flip this back to the front side. So now I'm just going to finish pinning the front of the top in place, because we don't have to stretch anything at the front. So just pinning that top to the waistline of the trousers. And once the front of your waistline is pinned in place, we can go in and start to sew this in place. So I've got my machine set to a normal straight stitch, and I'm just going to start by following around the front of the waistline, because that's going to be a lot easier than the back. And now I'm just reaching the back of the top. So like I said, I'm going to stretch and And just make sure that whenever you stretch, that your needle is down inside the fabric. Will stop things from sliding around. So stretch, like so. And just finishing off the final bit here. So I'm going to stretch and I'm just going to match it up to where I started that seam. And reverse just to secure that stitch. And now I'm just going to go in and finish off that raw edge with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. And once that waistline is all sewn in place, you can turn your jumpsuit to the right side out. So now there's only one thing left to do, and that's to finish off this bottom hem. I'm going to be adding a ruffle, which is what I like to do with this particular pattern. And I have a dedicated tutorial for that if you want to do the same. Otherwise, I would recommend just going with a standard double hem. So I would fold the bottom edge towards the wrong side once, and then fold it again and press that in place. And then you just want to sew that in place with a straight stitch around the rest of that bottom edge. And then once you finish these hems, then your jumpsuit is finished.